In the summer of 1914, as the great powers of Europe loaded their rifles and marched their sons toward the abattoir of the Western Front, the United States of America was something rare and enviable. A bystander. President Woodrow Wilson stood before the country and urged it to be neutral in thought as well as in action, to take no side in a quarrel of empires that had nothing to do with the New World. There was no reason, he said, for a single American boy to die in the mud of France, and most Americans agreed with him completely. The war was a European madness, 3,000 miles away, and America would sell to whoever could pay and bury no one. But 3,000 miles away, in a squat, columned building at the corner of Broad and Wall Streets, sat the most powerful private bank the world had ever produced. The House of Morgan needed no war to be rich. And yet when the guns opened up in Europe, J.P. Morgan and Company quietly became something no private company had ever been in the history of the Republic, not a bank, but an arm of a foreign war effort. In January of 1915, Morgan signed a contract making it the sole purchasing agent in the United States for the British Empire, and soon after, for France as well. Every shell, every rifle, every ton of steel and sack of wheat the Allies bought on American soil flowed through Morgan's ledgers, and on every dollar of it, Morgan took its commission. Then, in the autumn of 1915, the bank did the thing that would quietly weld the fate of the United States to the outcome of a European war. It arranged a loan, not a modest one, $500 million, the largest foreign loan in the history of the United States to that day, raised from American investors and handed to Britain and France so they could keep buying the tools to kill Germans. On paper, it was the finest piece of business the firm had ever done. In truth, it was a hook set deep in the nation's flesh, because a man who has lent $500 million to one side of a war can no longer be neutral about who wins it. He cannot afford for his debtor to lose. So when the war turned against the Allies, when the trenches froze into stalemate and Britain's gold ran thin, and the question of whether that loan would ever be repaid began to haunt the marble halls of Wall Street, a new and dangerous alignment of interests quietly took shape. Who exactly stood to lose a fortune if Germany won? And what were they willing to do, and to whom, to make certain that it never happened? To understand just how much money was at stake, and how completely the House of Morgan had tethered the American economy to the Allied cause, you have to look at the ledger books not as numbers but as a map of dependency. By the autumn of 1915, the British Empire was burning through something like $10 million a day in the United States. That is not a typographical error. $10 million every 24 hours, spent on canned beef, copper wiring, cotton for uniforms, steel billets, TNT, horses, leather, wheat, and the endless, gaping maw of artillery shells. The French were not far behind. Together, the Allies were purchasing between $20 and $25 million of American goods each day, and every single order, down to the last tin of bully beef, passed through the purchasing department that J.P. Morgan and Company had assembled at 23 Wall Street. The firm hired 175 clerks just to process invoices. The purchasing department eventually occupied an entire floor, then two, then spilled into adjacent buildings. It became, in effect, the largest buying organization in human history to that point, and it was run by a private bank that answered to no government. The contract Morgan signed with the British government in January 1915 gave the bank a 1% commission on everything it purchased. 1% sounds modest until you apply it to $3 billion. Because that is roughly the total volume of Allied war orders the House of Morgan handled between 1915 and 1917. $3 billion, a sum so vast it exceeded the entire national wealth of many European nations. 1% of $3 billion is $30 million in commissions, in an era when a factory worker earned about $10 a week. And that was only the purchasing commission. Morgan also charged fees for arranging shipping, for insurance, for currency exchange, for the letters of credit that greased every transaction. The bank was not merely profiting from the war. It was becoming structurally interwoven with the survival of Britain and France. Every contract signed in duplicate, every invoice stamped with the Morgan seal, was another filament of silk binding the bank's future to the trenches of the Somme. But commissions were the least of it. The real mechanism of entanglement was credit. By the middle of 1915, Britain had spent so much gold and so many dollars in the United States that its reserves were approaching a cliff. The pound sterling, the bedrock of international trade for a century, was being propped up by desperate, improvisational measures. Britain's gold reserves, the ultimate backing for its ability to pay for war material, had dropped to roughly $200 million, a dangerously thin cushion against the billions in orders already placed, and the billions more that would be needed if the war dragged on. The French were in an even worse position, their gold already being shipped across the Atlantic in heavily guarded steamers, each voyage a gamble against German U-boats. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. If the Allies could not find a way to borrow massive sums in the United States, they would be forced to slash their purchases. American factories would lose their largest customers. The boom that had lifted the U.S. economy out of the recession of 1913-1914 would collapse. Wheat farmers in Kansas, steelworkers in Pittsburgh, cotton brokers in New Orleans, thousands of miles from the Flanders mud, would feel the shock waves within weeks. The American economic numbers tell the story of this dependency with unnerving clarity. In 1914, U.S. exports to the Allies totaled roughly $800 million. In 1915, that figure more than doubled to approximately $1.7 billion. By 1916, it would approach $3 billion. The Allied war machine was not merely buying from America. It was, in a very real sense, being assembled on an American assembly line, paid for with American credit, and shipped on American hulls. The share of the United States economy tied directly to the Allied war effort climbed from a manageable fraction to something like 10 or 12% of the entire gross national product. Entire industries, explosives, copper, steel, grain, textiles, had been reoriented toward the European slaughter. To turn off the spigot of credit, to allow the Allies to run out of money and stop buying, was not an act of neutrality. It was an act of economic self-immolation, and no one in Washington, least of all the president, could pretend otherwise. Woodrow Wilson was acutely aware of the contradiction. The man was a former professor of political economy, the author of a well-regarded textbook on the subject, and he understood as well as any financier on Wall Street that a nation cannot be neutral in thought while being indispensable to the war effort of one side. His problem was that the machinery of his own government contained men who saw neutrality as a moral absolute, and men who saw it as a pragmatic inconvenience, and those two camps were about to collide with the force of a naval mine. The moral absolutist was William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State, a three-time presidential candidate, a prairie populist who believed with every fiber of his being that American boys should not die for European loans. The pragmatist was Robert Lansing, the State Department's counselor and later Bryan's replacement, a cold-eyed lawyer who kept a private diary in which he wrote, with startling candor, that the United States simply could not afford an Allied defeat. Lansing believed that American prosperity had become indistinguishable from an Allied victory, and he was willing to bend the rules of neutrality to ensure that outcome. The man who stood in the center of this vortex, the man who would have to navigate between the president's idealism, Bryan's righteousness, and Lansing's realpolitik, was not a politician at all. He was a banker, and to understand why he made the choices he made, you have to understand who he was before the war ever touched his ledgers. John Pierpont Morgan, Jr. Jack to everyone who mattered, was born in 1867 into a dynasty that already felt ancient. His father, the elder J.P. Morgan, was not merely a banker. He was a force of nature in a frock coat, a man who had personally bailout out the United States Treasury during the Panic of 1895, who had consolidated the railroads, who had formed U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. Jack grew up in the shadow of a monument. His father was physically imposing, a massive, bull-like man with a nose deformed by rhinophyma, a condition that gave his face a grotesque, tuberous appearance and made him a figure of whispered cruelty in the press. Jack was slender, soft-spoken, almost painfully shy. He was sent to St. Paul's School and then to Harvard, where he made few close friends and graduated without distinction. His life, for the first 40 years of it, was a long apprenticeship in deference. He collected art, he attended board meetings, he signed what his father told him to sign, and he waited. When the elder Morgan died in his sleep at the Grand Hotel in Rome in March 1913, Jack inherited the throne. The obituaries noted, with more politeness than conviction, that the son was a capable steward of the father's empire. But the empire Jack inherited was not the one his father had built. The old man had been a colossus of the railroad age, a consolidator, a trust builder, a man who imposed order on chaotic industries through sheer force of will and capital. Jack was a different creature entirely. He was meticulous, cautious, deeply conscious of his own limitations. He once told a friend that he felt like a man who had been handed the controls of a locomotive without ever having been taught how to drive it. The great historian Ron Chernow, in his definitive history of the House of Morgan, describes Jack as a man perpetually haunted by the question of whether he was worthy of his name. He had none of his father's theatrical dominance, none of his volcanic temper. What he had was a profound sense of duty, to the firm, to the family name, to the country, and a conviction, instilled from the cradle, that the House of Morgan did not fail. In the summer of 1914, as the European crisis deepened, Jack was on a yacht off the coast of Maine. The news reached him in fragments: the assassination of the Archduke, the Austrian ultimatum, the Russian mobilization, the German march through Belgium. When the markets began to seize up in late July, Jack cut his vacation short and took the train back to New York. The stock exchange closed its doors on July 31, 1914, and would not reopen fully for more than 4 months, the longest shutdown in its history. Panic was spreading through the financial system. European investors were dumping American securities to repatriate gold. The dollar was under pressure. And into this chaos stepped the British government, asking, almost immediately, whether the House of Morgan might be willing to serve as its purchasing agent in the United States. Jack did not leap at the offer. He consulted his partners, the men who formed the inner circle of the firm: Henry P. Davison, the brilliant, restless, socially magnetic banker who had risen from a small-town Pennsylvania boyhood to become one of the most powerful financiers in the world; Thomas W. Lamont, the silky, cerebral Harvard man who could write a diplomatic cable as smoothly as he could structure a bond issue; Dwight Morrow, the future father-in-law of Charles Lindbergh, a man of such precise intellect that his partners joked he could calculate the interest on a loan before the borrower finished asking for it. Together, these men debated the risks, serving as the purchasing agent for a belligerent power while the United States was formally neutral was, at best, a legal gray area. The State Department had not yet clarified whether such arrangements violated the spirit of neutrality. But the British were the world's greatest credit risk. If you could not trust the British Empire, you could trust no one, and the commissions, even at 1%, would be enormous. The partners voted to accept. The contract was signed, and within weeks the scale of the operation had exceeded anything they had imagined. By the autumn of 1915, the operation was choking on its own success. The Allies were buying so much that they were running out of cash. The British government had already sold off a significant portion of its American securities portfolio, had shipped gold across the Atlantic in great, silent convoys, and had exhausted every short-term credit facility available. The French were in an even more desperate state. The war on the Western Front had settled into a static, mechanized slaughter that consumed material at a rate no pre-war planner had anticipated. The Battle of Loos had just concluded in October 1915, a British offensive that cost more than 50,000 casualties and gained almost no ground. The lesson of Loos and of every offensive on the Western Front in 1915 was that this war would be won not by generalship but by logistics, by the side that could produce the most shells, the most barbed wire, the most machine guns, and keep producing them month after month. And the factory that could produce them most efficiently was the United States, but the factory would not run on promises. So, in October 1915, a delegation of British and French financiers arrived in New York to ask the House of Morgan to do something that had never been done before: to raise a loan of $500 million, the equivalent of roughly $12 billion today, from American investors, and hand it to foreign governments at war. The delegation was led by the British Treasury's representative, Lord Reading, a brilliant Jewish lawyer who had risen to the highest ranks of British public life, and by the French Finance Ministry's emissary, Octave Hammerg. They met with Jack Morgan and his partners in the bank's private offices at 23 Wall Street, a low-ceilinged, mahogany-paneled room that had seen more financial history than any other space in the hemisphere. The atmosphere was cordial but freighted with desperation. The British and French were not negotiating from strength. They were negotiating from a position of imminent collapse. The problem was not merely economic. It was political. In August 1914, at the very outset of the war, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan had informed the House of Morgan that loans to belligerent nations, while not technically illegal, were inconsistent with the true spirit of neutrality. Bryan was a pacifist of deep and genuine conviction. He believed that if American banks financed the war, American financial interests would inevitably drag the country into the conflict. He was not wrong about that. But his position, however principled, was already being eroded by the realities of the American economy. The Wilson administration had initially permitted the extension of short-term commercial credits to the Allies, essentially allowing American exporters to sell goods on credit to European buyers, on the grounds that this was normal trade finance, not war lending. But the distinction was a fiction. A loan by any other name is still a debt, and a debt still creates an interest in the debtor's survival. By the autumn of 1915, the fiction was unraveling. The Allies needed a real loan, a massive one, and they needed it now. The negotiations inside 23 Wall Street were intense and secret. Jack Morgan, according to the accounts later compiled by historians, was acutely aware of the political sensitivity. He did not want to be seen as defying the president. He dispatched Henry Davison to Washington to sound out the administration. Davison, a man of immense charm and restless energy, met with Robert Lansing and through Lansing conveyed a simple message to the White House. The Allies were running out of money. If they could not borrow, they would stop buying. If they stopped buying, the American economy would crater. And if the American economy cratered, the political consequences for the Wilson administration would be catastrophic. The message was phrased as a warning, but it was also a piece of leverage. The House of Morgan was telling the president, with exquisite politeness, that the nation's economic health now depended on the very loans that his own Secretary of State had condemned as unneutral. Wilson listened. He always listened carefully, turning the problem over in his mind like a man examining a diamond for flaws. The president was, in many ways, a tragic figure in this story, a man of genuine intellectual brilliance and moral seriousness, who found himself trapped between his ideals and the gravitational pull of material forces he could not control. He had won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." He meant it. He desperately wanted to be the peacemaker, the neutral arbiter who would bring the warring powers to a negotiated settlement. But he was also a man who believed in the providential destiny of the United States, and he understood that a nation whose factories were running at full capacity to supply one side of a war was, in practice, no longer neutral. In late October 1915, Wilson quietly reversed the administration's position. He let it be known, through Lansing, that the government would no longer object to the extension of loans to belligerent nations. The moral absolutist position collapsed, and William Jennings Bryan, the great populist tribune, had already resigned in June 1915, not over the loan question directly, but over Wilson's handling of the Lusitania crisis, which Bryan saw as a drift toward war. His departure removed the last principled obstacle inside the cabinet to the financial integration of the United States with the Allied cause. With the political path cleared, the House of Morgan moved with astonishing speed. The $500 million Anglo-French loan was announced to the public in October 1915. It was, by an enormous margin, the largest single loan ever floated in the United States. Morgan and a syndicate of banks, including National City Bank, Chase National Bank, and other pillars of the financial establishment, offered the bonds to American investors with an interest rate of 5%, a generous return in an era of low inflation. The sales pitch was not merely financial. The bond prospectus and the advertising that accompanied it framed the loan as a patriotic act, not patriotic to the United States exactly, but patriotic to civilization. The Allies were portrayed as the defenders of democracy against Prussian militarism. American investors were being asked to bet on an Allied victory, and the bet was structured to make a great deal of money if they won. But the American public was not uniformly enthusiastic. Large swaths of the country, particularly in the Midwest and among Irish Americans and German Americans, were deeply hostile to the Allied cause. The German-American community was one of the largest ethnic groups in the country, numbering some 8 million people, and its newspapers, its churches, its civic organizations were overwhelmingly opposed to American involvement on the side of the Entente. The Irish Americans, nursing a centuries-old grievance against British rule, were equally suspicious. The loan syndicate had to work hard to sell the bonds, and the initial subscription was slower than Morgan had hoped. The bank deployed its full network of correspondents and brokers, leaned on its relationships with institutional investors, and quietly made it known that the bonds were, in effect, too important to fail, that the survival of the American export economy depended on the success of this issuance. By early 1916, the loan had been placed, the funds had been transferred, and the Allies had the credit line they needed to keep the American arsenal running. The hook was set. While these financial machinations were unfolding in the marble corridors of Wall Street, a parallel drama was playing out in the Atlantic Ocean, a drama that would intersect with the House of Morgan's story in ways that no one could have predicted, and that would ultimately answer the question of what men are willing to do when their fortunes are tied to the outcome of a war. On May 7, 1915, the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania was steaming off the coast of Ireland when a German U-boat, U-20, put a single torpedo into her hull. The ship sank in 18 minutes. Of the 1,959 passengers and crew aboard, 1,198 died, including 128 Americans. The sinking was a seismic event in American public opinion. The German government had declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone, and the German embassy in Washington had placed a warning in American newspapers, directly alongside the Lusitania's sailing schedule, advising travelers that they sailed at their own risk. But the scale of the slaughter, the images of women and children drowning in the cold Atlantic, shattered the complacency of a nation that had believed itself insulated from the war. Theodore Roosevelt called it murder on the high seas. Wilson, though deeply shaken, resisted the calls for an immediate declaration of war. He sent a series of diplomatic notes to Berlin, each one sharper than the last, demanding that Germany abandon unrestricted submarine warfare. Bryan resigned over the third note, convinced that Wilson was steering the nation toward war. Lansing, who replaced him, believed that war was probably inevitable and that the United States should prepare for it. The Lusitania crisis did not, by itself, bring America into the war. That would take another 2 years, and the final trigger would be the Zimmermann Telegram of 1917, in which Germany offered Mexico an alliance and the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if the United States entered the war. But the Lusitania did something more subtle and perhaps more significant. It created a moral framework that aligned perfectly with the financial interests of the House of Morgan. After the sinking, it became increasingly difficult for Americans to see the war as a quarrel of empires in which both sides were equally culpable. Germany, in the American imagination, became the aggressor, the violator of neutral rights, the beast of the U-boat. Britain and France, whatever their imperial sins, became the defenders of civilized norms. The propaganda war, carefully managed by British intelligence, which had cut the transatlantic German cables at the start of the war, and thus controlled the flow of information to the American press, reinforced this narrative at every turn. The Bryce Report, a British government document that detailed alleged German atrocities in Belgium, was published in 1915 and widely circulated in the United States, even though many of its claims were later discredited. The financial bet that Morgan had placed on an Allied victory was now buttressed by a moral consensus that an Allied victory was also a just one. The two currents, profit and principle, were merging into a single, powerful river. And then, on July 3, 1915, a man with a pistol walked into the Long Island mansion of Jack Morgan and nearly changed the course of financial history. His name was Erich Muenter. He was a former German instructor at Harvard who had become a radical anti-war activist, consumed by the conviction that the House of Morgan was the hidden engine driving America toward intervention. Muenter had already attempted to bomb the United States Capitol, placing a stick of dynamite in the Senate chamber that detonated in the early morning hours of July 2, causing minor damage but no casualties. The next day, he took a train to Glen Cove, New York, where the Morgans kept a sprawling estate called East Island. He gained entry to the house by claiming he was a friend of the family, and when Jack Morgan appeared in the hallway to greet him, Muenter produced 2 revolvers and fired. One bullet struck Morgan in the hip, the other in the groin. Morgan, despite his wounds, lunged at Muenter and wrestled him to the ground. The banker's wife, Jane, and a servant piled on, and together they subdued the gunman. Morgan was rushed to surgery. The wounds were serious but not fatal. The bullet in his groin had missed the femoral artery by a fraction of an inch. He recovered, and within weeks he was back at his desk at 23 Wall Street. The assassination attempt was front-page news across the country. Muenter, who killed himself in jail before he could be tried, left behind a manifesto in which he denounced the Morgan War Syndicate and accused the bank of conspiring to drag the United States into the European conflict for profit. The newspapers treated Muenter as a madman, and in many respects he was. His actions were those of a deeply disturbed individual. But the core of his accusation was not easily dismissed. The House of Morgan was, in fact, the sole purchasing agent for the Allies. It was, in fact, arranging enormous loans that linked American prosperity to an Allied victory. And the men who ran the bank were, in fact, among the most influential voices in shaping American policy toward the war, through their personal connections to the Wilson administration, through their control of credit, through their sheer gravitational pull on the financial system. Muenter was paranoid, but he was not entirely wrong. This is the contradiction at the heart of the story. The men who profited most from Allied victory were also the men closest to the levers of American power, and the distinction between their private interests and the national interest had become so blurred as to be almost invisible. Jack Morgan was not a cartoon villain rubbing his hands together and cackling about war profits. He was a cautious, dutiful, deeply conventional man who genuinely believed that an Allied victory was in the interest of civilization, and that the House of Morgan was performing a patriotic service by financing it. But beliefs are shaped by the ledgers we keep. A man who has committed his firm's prestige and his nation's savings to the survival of Britain and France is a man who will interpret every German submarine attack as an outrage and every Allied setback as a crisis demanding American intervention. He does not need to be a conspirator. The structure of his interests does the conspiring for him. The historians who have examined this period most carefully, among them Charles Callan Tansil, whose 1938 book America Goes to War remains one of the most detailed accounts of the economic pressures behind American intervention, and John Milton Cooper, Jr., the preeminent biographer of Woodrow Wilson, have concluded that the financial entanglement with the Allies was a necessary condition for American entry into the war, even if it was not a sufficient one. The submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, the ideological affinity between Wilsonian progressivism and British liberalism, the genuine strategic interest the United States had in preventing a German hegemony over Europe, all of these factors mattered. They mattered enormously. No serious historian argues that the House of Morgan single-handedly maneuvered the United States into war. The world is not that simple, and history is not a puppet show. But the financial entanglement mattered too, and it mattered in a way that is often understated in the standard diplomatic histories. By the end of 1916, American banks had lent the Allies roughly $2.3 billion. American investors held billions more in Allied bonds. The export economy had become so dependent on Allied purchases that a sudden cessation of those purchases would have triggered a depression. The financial community, the Wilson administration, and a significant portion of the public had all, in their different ways, placed a bet on an Allied victory. When Germany announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917, a desperate gamble to starve Britain into submission before American intervention could become decisive, the bet was called. Wilson broke diplomatic relations with Germany. In March, the Zimmermann telegram was made public. On April 2, 1917, Wilson went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war. The world, he said, must be made safe for democracy. And on April 6, the United States entered the Great War. The cost of that entry is almost impossible to comprehend. The United States mobilized more than 4 million men. Of those, roughly 116,000 died, more than in Korea and Vietnam combined, and more than 200,000 were wounded. The flu pandemic of 1918, spread in part by troop movements, killed another 675,000 Americans. The financial cost, measured in direct government expenditures, was roughly $32 billion, a sum that dwarfed the entire national debt before the war, and the war debts that the Allies had accumulated to American banks, and later to the United States Treasury, became a poison in the international system. The loans that Morgan had arranged were eventually refinanced by the U.S. government after America entered the war, so the bank itself did not bear the losses when, in the 1920s and 1930s, the Allies struggled to repay. The losses were socialized. The profits had been privatized. The war debt question poisoned relations between the United States and its former allies for a generation, contributed to the economic instability of the 1920s, and became one of the grievances that fueled the rise of fascism in Europe. 2 decades later, the reckoning came. Between 1934 and 1936, a special Senate committee chaired by Senator Gerald P. Nye of North Dakota conducted an investigation into the role of the munitions industry and the financial sector in bringing the United States into the First World War. The Nye Committee, as it was called, hauled bankers and industrialists before the cameras and subjected them to a public interrogation that seared the phrase "merchants of death" into the American consciousness. Jack Morgan, by then an elderly man, was called to testify. He sat in the hearing room, his face gaunt and his hands trembling slightly, and he defended the integrity of his firm with the same quiet stubbornness he had brought to every crisis of his life. The committee's final report did not prove a conspiracy, but it documented, in exhaustive detail, the ways in which the financial entanglement with the Allies had narrowed the options available to American policymakers. It concluded that the arms industry and the banking sector had profited enormously from the war and had, at the very least, been indifferent to the human cost of their profits. The hearings gave powerful momentum to the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, a series of laws designed to prevent the United States from ever again being drawn into a foreign war through the mechanism of economic entanglement. Those laws, however well-intentioned, would later hamstring the American response to the rise of Hitler and delay the aid that might have prevented the Second World War. I want to be careful here. The story I have told you can easily curdle into a simplistic morality tale, the bankers as villains, the government as their puppet, the war as a mere profit-seeking enterprise. That version of events is not true. It is a cartoon. The reality is messier, more human, and in some ways more disturbing. The men of the House of Morgan were not evil. They were, by the standards of their time and class, honorable men doing what they believed was right. Their tragedy, and ours, is that what they believed was right happened to align with what made them rich. That alignment is not a conspiracy. It is something more insidious and more common. It is the quiet, almost automatic way in which self-interest dresses itself in the language of principle. The submarine warfare was real. The Zimmermann telegram was real. The German autocracy was a genuine threat to the liberal order that Wilson and his generation believed in. The United States had reasons for going to war that were entirely independent of the ledgers of J.P. Morgan and Company, but those ledgers were there, in the background, quietly narrowing the range of outcomes that powerful people were willing to accept. And that is the thing about money and war. Money does not need to dictate policy. It only needs to make certain policies unthinkable. There is a moment, late in the war, that captures this truth with almost unbearable clarity. In the summer of 1918, with the German spring offensives threatening to break the Allied lines, Jack Morgan received a cable from the British Treasury. The situation, the cable said, was desperate. The British needed another loan immediately to keep the supplies moving. Morgan read the cable in his office at 23 Wall Street, beneath the portrait of his father that hung on the wall, and he authorized the credit without hesitation. He had no choice. He had passed the point of no choice years before. The loans he had arranged, the commissions he had taken, the bonds he had sold to widows and schoolteachers and small-town banks, all of it had created a structure of obligation so vast that to refuse the British now would be to pull the keystone from an arch and watch everything collapse. He was not a free agent. He was a man who had built a machine that now controlled him, and in that he was not so different from his country. The lesson is not that bankers are uniquely wicked. The lesson is that neutrality is a fragile thing, easily eroded by the slow drip of economic interest. A nation that profits from one side of a war is no longer a bystander. It is a stakeholder, and stakeholders eventually become participants. The United States learned this lesson in the First World War, forgot it in the boom years of the 1920s, relearned it in the hearings of the Nye Committee, and then forgot it again in the long decades of global hegemony that followed. Every generation, it seems, must rediscover for itself the truth that money is not silent. It speaks. It whispers in the ears of the powerful. It reframes what is possible and what is necessary. And when the ledgers are large enough, the whisper becomes a command. The House of Morgan took its commission on every shell that sailed for France. The commission was the mechanism, the quiet percentage that made the whole machine worth running. It was also the signature of a bargain that the United States as a whole would eventually be asked to honor, not in dollars, but in blood. If you want to remember the mechanism that turned a neutral nation into a belligerent one, the word to leave in the comments below is commission. That word is the key to this entire story. The quiet, 1% thread that pulled America across the Atlantic. And if this channel is your kind of history, not the sanitized version from textbooks, but the ledger books, the back rooms, the moments where money and power quietly decided the fate of millions, then hit subscribe. We release a new episode every week. The next one is already in production. It is about the day the British Empire ran out of cash and the man who stepped in to buy its empire on the cheap. You will not want to miss it.